All right, well, why don't we go ahead and get started with our evening tonight? So a little bit of paperwork stuff first. If you guys could all go ahead and mute, we are recording this right now. So that means we'll be able to make sure we get this posted as quickly as possible. I'll introduce myself in case you're new. My name is Bob Bruner. I am the A&R Extension Educator with Purdue Cooperative Extension Service. I'm based out of Clay and Owen counties in Indiana. I know we do get a few people from out of state here, so if you want an idea, we're just a little bit south and a touch west of Indianapolis. And tonight we are going to be talking about sunflowers. So what I usually ask is please, if you have any questions, go ahead and post them in the chat. Oftentimes I will address the questions as I go, but if I miss one, I will always come back and get them at the end of the program. So just go ahead and put them in there. If you don't hear me address it during the program, I will get to them at the end. So why don't we just jump in? Like you guys probably heard Karen just talking about, she desperately wants sunflowers in her yard. I actually grew up with sunflowers. My mother planted sunflowers every year. She planted them because she wanted the seeds from confection sunflowers to be able to eat the seeds. So we had them sprouting for several years in a row. And ever since then, I've always wanted them back in my yard. And now that I own my own home and have for a few years now, I wanted to go ahead and plant sunflowers to see if I could grow them too. But the problem is, I didn't know anything about growing sunflowers, which kind of inspired me to go ahead and give this program because I would educate myself and I give you guys something that you might be interested in too. Now, one of the things I really love doing when I can is I love to give context of where some of our plants come from or why we do some of the things we do with them. And sunflowers have a surprisingly rich history. Now, the great thing about sunflowers is that these are native. They are from the continental United States, specifically North America. They're from our prairies and have grown on our continent for several thousand years now. Um, there is significant amount of historical evidence that indicates that the indigenous nations of North America grew them at least as far back as 1,000 years, using them as a source of food, a source of food grade oil and dyes, as well as construction material. And some of the information, like if you look at the National Sunflower Association, according to their historian, this goes back almost as far as 3,000 years. Now, I myself am not a historian. I can't verify that, but I did find it really, really interesting that there is a significant history behind this plant. It's definitely as or more American than apple pie. Now, one thing that I found particularly fascinating about sunflowers is that this plant has made its way across the world, and it did so fairly quickly. As far back as the 16th or 17th century, it was actually picked up by European travelers and then transported to Europe, where they began using it in all sorts of places as food or as an ornamental. But what's really, really fascinating to me is that it was heavily adopted by the Russians. Now, some historians believe that it was introduced into Russia thanks to Peter the Great. What Russians did with this is the Russian Orthodox Church maintained the practice of Lent. So they wouldn't be able to consume a whole lot of foods, and oils was one of those foods that they couldn't consume during Lent. However, their list of prohibited foods did not include sunflower oil. So Russian churchgoers would start using oil derived from sunflower seed as something they could use during Lent, and it just kind of exploded over there. We didn't really start growing sunflowers again here in North America until they were reintroduced to our country sometime before 1970. And the varieties that were reintroduced were ones that were hybridized over in Russia. And if you look up several plantable varieties right now, when you buy seeds, you'll notice that several of those seed varieties actually still have Russian names to them. And I was actually doing this research this afternoon because I wanted to check on it myself. Um, Now, we originally didn't have much of a sunflower industry here because of its popularity across the pond. But before 1970, we just suddenly started reproducing these plants like crazy, and both the US and Canada had a massive development of this crop. Acreage that was being grown for sunflowers capped at about 5 million, but now it's gone down since, as you guys have probably noticed, sunflowers aren't grown quite everywhere now. And we have about 3 million acres dedicated to our sunflower crops in the US today. And those are primarily going to be composed of the seed-bearing sunflowers that we're really interested in. So sunflowers that are producing oil seed and sunflowers that are producing confectionery seed. And I'm going to go over those in just a moment. So there are a few different types of sunflowers to discuss. Sunflowers have uses that cross a lot of barriers. When I was researching this, I was just fascinated by how many different ways we make use of a single species of plant. Most of the sunflowers you will ever see are all Helianthus annus, which is the one species of sunflower that we all recognize. So if we look at some of those different types, the big way that they're differentiated from each other are what are they producing? So I mentioned a couple of these. There's oilseed sunflowers, confection sunflowers. We also have sunflowers developed for cut flower industries, and they're considered actually really, really good flowers for that purpose because these are great plants. They're very tough and they're very easy to grow. And of course, plenty of us actually grow them ornamentally. Right now, the sunflowers that I'm growing, I just want them because I like sunflowers and I think they look pretty. However, like a lot of people, I didn't necessarily check exactly what cultivar I was growing. I just went, hey, I'm going to put these in my yard and see what happens. So this, of course, brings up the question you see here at the bottom of this slide, the one that I, the extension educator, failed to ask myself. What are you wanting out of your sunflowers? Now, this can complicate things. If you're wanting sunflowers for their seed, you need to ask yourself, what kind of seed are you wanting? Are you wanting to create a business and produce oil seed? Or are you wanting them just because you want sunflower seeds to have as a snack for your home and your family? Nothing wrong with either one. If you are a horticulturalist who might want to sell cut flowers, sunflowers, that's a specific cultivar that you need to consider. And of course, if you're growing them for ornamentals, you probably have the easiest job out of all of them because it's not hard. These plants are great. They are just absolutely resilient. They'll come up in just about any kind of soil. So let's go into sunflowers as crops a little bit. I mentioned this a touch before, and this is more aimed towards the business end of this. So if we look at this, we have oil seed and we have confection seed. Now, oil seeds can be differentiated from confection because oil seeds are very small, they're black, they don't have as much striping, they have a very tight seed. Whereas confection seeds, the ones that you would buy in a store for a snack, are much larger and they have those big telltale white stripes on them. This is the primary way that we tell the difference between these two plants because most of the time we look at sunflowers, there isn't any real noticeable difference until the plant is really far along in developing those seeds. Most of the time, you're going to see that flowers that are being produced for seeds are going to have large seed head. They're going to have large flower heads on them because they want that great big seed production to help support them. And here's a handy picture I got out of the Iowa Ag Literacy Foundation that just kind of demonstrates the difference between these two seed types. So on the left here, we have our oil seed, which is that really tight seed that the hull doesn't have much in the way of striping. These are seeds that are going to be crushed and pressed for their oils. Sometimes they're called black oil seeds. However, on the other side, we have our confection sunflower seeds with their great big holes, much larger seed, and those very obvious white stripes on them. So when we talk about oil seed, most of the time we're talking about something that's producing linoleic acid, linoleic oil. That is what we're interested in when we use our oil seed. And linoleic oil is used in a lot of different areas of cooking and other things. So this is a very common additive to our food market. This is the only oil seed native to North America. So just digest that for a minute. We have quite literally millions of acres of soybeans, sorghum, and a whole bunch of oilseed producing plants. None of them are native to our continent. Most of them are either South or Central American in origin, like corn plants. Some of them are Asian. But this is ours. Sunflowers are our oil seed. This is our original crop right here. And I just absolutely loved learning that fact as an extension educator. Now, our confection seeds, this is what's making up a significant portion of our growing practice throughout the North and South Dakota area. They grow tons of these. It's a prairie environment, which is what the sunflowers are native to. However, the processing happens in the Midwest. It happens here in Illinois, Indiana, and other places. So we are actually contributing in our own way to the sunflower market. So we're helping get that tasty stuff that we like giving our kids, and the stuff we still love to eat too. Now, ornamental sunflowers, there's not really a whole lot to be able to say about ornamental sunflowers here. There isn't a whole lot of difference beyond just simple growing practices. Oh, I see we have a question that I think is important to address now. So you're asking, are we growing non-native sunflowers due to the Russian takeover? No, these are native plants. What it was is they were introduced into Russia, but this is their native environment. They have not varied genetically far enough to make them a different species, and they are adapted for this environment. They are a prairie plant, so not so much the Midwest environment, but go further west of here and past the Rockies, and yeah, that is where they are from. And I see another question: what about seed grown for bird feeding? All that seed is most of the time it's going to be confection seed that I've seen mixed in, but there's also oil seed that I've seen mixed into bird feeders. And that actually brings up another really good point that I'm going to hit in just a little bit, I promise. So remind me if I don't hit that point about bird feeders. But about ornamental sunflowers. So these plants are really interesting in some ways. There are several different kinds of cultivars based on what you want here. So you can actually have sunflower cultivars that are branching that produce multiple flower heads. And you'll find members of that group under cultivar names such as Sonia or the Joker, which I thought was really entertaining. And there are several more. If I put a very large list up here, it'd take up several slides actually. You can also grow pollenless cultivars, and those are intended for cut flowers or particular kinds of ornamentals. Now, I love the idea of growing the pollenless sunflower, and I'm probably going to try that next year because I don't know about you guys, but I have terrible hay fever. And right now, I usually would be sneezing right now, but I'm kind of hopped up on medication to make sure I don't because it has been going crazy this year. So having something growing that doesn't produce pollen in my yard sounds absolutely wonderful. You can also get several cultivars that are going to contain dwarf, semi-dwarf, and giants. Part of me is kind of curious, and I'd love to see what some of those look like. I'm really interested in seeing if I can grow a giant cultivar just to see how large they get and see if I can actually make them get larger too. But obviously, if you're choosing to grow any of these cultivars listed here, they're probably going to have special requirements to them, especially the dwarf or the giant cultivars. They're almost certainly going to need a little bit more care to be able to make them grow appropriately, because if you have your growth stunted or you have your growth amplified, that means that your needs are going to vary really wildly. I mean, I can only imagine the amount of fertilizer and care that it would take to grow some of the giant cultivars. But again, this is still a fairly easy plant to develop when it compared to some of the ones we've talked about, like our roses. So I want to dive in a little bit on sunflower biology because there are a few notable things. One of them is heliotropism, which I'm going to go into in a moment. So sunflowers do belong to the aster family, Asteraceae. So this is going to have our asters, daisies, composites, and of course our sunflowers. So this, many of you will know, asters are a part of the native biology of plants in Indiana. So you're not really risking a whole lot here. You're not going to get, you're not, it's not like you're introducing something that's going to do something bad. However, like you've seen in other programs, there's always a caveat. Sunflowers do emit an inhibitor, and this inhibitor is intended for surrounding plants, kind of like an oak tree or a walnut tree. It's not going to ruin your ground. It's not going to make it so you can't plant anything ever again, but it is going to make sure that nothing is going to compete with them while they're there. So if you choose to plant sunflowers, you need to make sure you're giving them space. They have wide root systems. You're not going to want to plant your tomatoes nearby. In particular, your pole beans should probably be well away from any sunflowers you're developing. Now, right now, I have mine planted in spacing between spiderwort. So we have a significant amount of spiderwort growing in our yard that we love. And I'm a little concerned that I may have gotten it close to one of the stands, but spiderwort themselves are actually kind of are fairly resilient plants. So we're going to see how that works. I don't think any major damage is going to happen in that regard, but just keep in mind, they will inhibit the development of other plants around them. And one of the things, of course, we love sunflowers, and this is something we all grew up with as kids, is we learned that sunflowers like to follow the sun. They track the sun in the sky. So our sunflowers that we deal with, they are all primarily annuals, but there are some perennial varieties that you're going to be working with depending on the species that you're working with. But for the most part, sunflowers are going to be annual. Some of the species that you may have or cultivars are going to have more than one flowering head, whereas some will just have that single one to them. And sunflowers can get tall. I remember growing up, our sunflowers topped about 7 feet, and my mother had them placed really well. They had full sun. There was no other plants near them. So those things shot right out of the ground. And apparently she had done her fertilizer work or we had good soil right there. So just keep that in mind. When I think about it in my location, I have plenty of low-lying power lines just due to being in an old neighborhood. So I kind of watch where I'm planting things to make sure nothing comes up too close and makes me a little uncomfortable. So just keep that in mind as you plan for sunflowers. So some of the neat things about sunflowers is when I refer to that flowering head, the reason I'm not calling it the flower itself is because it's actually not true. What you're seeing here in the center of that head, where all that funny, hairy looking material is, those are actually the flowers. They're referred to as florets. They're very tightly packed, and each one will produce fruit on its own, namely the seeds that we're interested in. Whereas the yellow petals around the flower are actually the protective leaves that surround the outside of the flower. They're just bright yellow and they will close around the head to protect it during poor conditions. So keep in mind, when you have a single sunflower growing, you actually have a few hundred sunflowers growing. They're just very, very tiny right in the middle of that head. And of course, I mentioned sunflower heliotropism, and this picture really, really demonstrates it. I really appreciate the North Carolina Department of Transportation for taking this picture because it just shows absolutely what sunflowers do. So the heliotropism is the tendency of the flower heads to track the sun throughout the day. But we get it a little bit wrong when we're growing up, when we're told, oh, sunflowers will just follow the sun. They do that as they're developing. So as the head is really beginning to flower out and it's developing its seeds, it's going to be tracking the sun. However, when it reaches its full development, they're going to stop tracking the sun. And what they're going to do is they are going to face east almost all the time. And that will probably remain mostly true unless they're planted in a location where east facing won't work for them to get the best amount of sun. Then they're just simply going to orient based on the most intense heat of the day that they can get, most likely. So there will be exceptions there. It'd be really interesting if someone grew sunflowers and ended up that they tended to face west because maybe like the east side of your property isn't getting as much sun during certain times of the day. Okay, so developing sunflowers. Um, this was entertaining to me because we've done several programs over the last year and a half now. Goodness, it's been that long. And I've talked about starting plants that can be challenging, that are going to need more fertilizer, that are going to need babying when they're growing. And man, sunflowers just aren't that. They are actually really easy to grow. They are hardy plants. They can survive in just about any kind of soil type you put them in. So I live in Terre Haute. I have very sandy soil. I'm near the Wabash River. So this is going to be causing me problems inherently. And on top of that, I'm on sandy soil towards the top of a hill. So water is running down, which means my soil is automatically fairly well drained. I'm watering my tomatoes right now about twice a day because of how dry it is, and water just doesn't stay here. The sunflowers, however, I accidentally ignored them for like 2 weeks, and they are just growing to beat the band right now. I've started watering and fertilizing them just in case, but they're taking off. These are full sun plants, if you hadn't gotten that idea yet, and they prefer the ground pH to be somewhere between 6.0 and 7.5. I have seen that some prefer 6.0 and 6.8, but honestly, I think that if you're above 6 and you're not heading too far into acidic conditions, you're probably going to be fine. Most of the soils that I encounter in the area where I live and work are going to be at least slightly acidic. And I imagine that's going to be true for a good portion of the listening area right now. So get your soil tested just in case, or maybe use a pH meter if you have one. I'm guessing most likely this isn't going to be a gigantic concern for you, though. So the great thing about sunflowers is they are drought resistant. So this is a great year to start your sunflowers. Now, planting sunflowers is going to be a little bit of a problem now. These are best planted late May, which is when I put mine into the ground. And it's going to take them some time to germinate and shoot up. They will germinate very easily. And this is getting back to that question about bird feeders we had. They will germinate right under your bird feeder too. If the birds scatter some of the sunflowers, you will have sunflowers if none of the squirrels get to them. However, if you're intentionally planting them, if it takes a week or two for them to sprout, don't despair. That's what I saw in my own yard, and they are growing great right now. You just got to be a little patient. If they haven't sprouted, don't overwater them. They do need well-drained soil, and you don't want the seed to rot. Don't fertilize them yet if they hadn't sprout, but once they've sprouted and really start to grow, not when they just have some of the seed leaves coming out, but when they start gaining that foot to 2 feet worth of height, then fertilize. That's also when you want to do your deep watering practices. Now, one thing I'm going to add to this, and this is going a little bit against what Karen was asking earlier, is sunflowers don't technically need fertilizer. They are well adapted to our environment, and usually our soils have them. However, if they're growing heavily, then they're going to need some fertilizer probably. So if you're growing something like a giant, you're going to be fertilizing that guy as he shoots up, because that's going to absorb a lot of energy as it develops. This also goes for if you're wanting sunflowers for seeding, because they need that energy to produce that seed. However, what I want to add to that is be a little bit aware. You don't want to burn these. Don't use too much nitrogen. They are kind of sensitive to that. Balanced fertilizer will get the job done. I was even talking earlier, I'm using fertilizer intended for roses, which is normally high phosphorus, and it seems to be working out just fine. It's got like 8% nitrogen in it right now, I think. Okay, so I went over this just a little bit, but while these are drought resistant, you are going to want to make sure that you're doing deep watering during their most intensive growing periods. What I want you to think about, though, is consider when that intensive growing period is. Because my sunflowers right now are sitting at about 2 feet. And I'm estimating that they're probably going to hit about 4 or 5 feet sometime in July. That is going to be the hottest, almost the driest time of the summer. And folks, we are nearing drought conditions already. I would guess that a lot of our counties are already in drought level 1 or level 0. So we need to be paying attention to that. And you're going to want to make sure you do that deep watering for these sunflowers as they hit their most intense growth. The optimal time is going to be about 20 days before and 20 days after flowering, basically when seed development's happening. So that way they're getting that requisite amount of energy they need to be able to keep going. And of course, the big reason why we want to do this is because sunflowers have fairly expansive root systems. So what you're doing there is you're enhancing those root systems and helping them grow larger and enhancing their capacity to absorb more nutrients right out of the soil. All right, so I kind of talked about this, but I'll hit it again. So balanced fertilizer is going to work best. So you're talking like a 12-12-12 fertilizer. But again, I'm finding that as long as you're just simply not overdoing it, you're probably going to be okay. Just make sure you're not overdoing the nitrogen. And if your plants get over 3 feet, you need to consider staking them. Treat them a little bit like tomatoes at that point, because they're going to grow fast, but they're still going to be a little bit thin. And once they reach their height, though, they'll start widening out and get a little stronger, so you may not need to worry as much. But as they grow, you're going to want to stake those sunflowers. This will also help, too, for those of you who live in heavy wildlife traffic areas, so the wildlife doesn't just accidentally break your sunflowers as they walk by. Okay, so my favorite part, and I'm sure the rest of you are kind of groaning at this part, but it's important, are the disease and pest management issues with sunflowers. The good thing is most of this stuff is fairly easily handled. There are very few things that are going to kill sunflowers. The thing that I'm showing you here in this last image that I'm going to talk about are our rusts and our mildews. These are the diseases that are going to be the primary concern for sunflowers. Both of them are fungal diseases in origin, and they like to happen in wet conditions. So if you are growing sunflowers and we encounter a period of cool nights with moisture or good dew on the grass, that means that you need to be watching for these fungal diseases to start occurring. But the good thing is that general garden fungicide can handle both of these fairly well. Rusts aren't really that bad within most plants unless that's a very, very heavy infestation. So let's take a look at this previous image for a second. So I'd call this a bit of a rough infestation, but I wouldn't say that it's going to kill this plant. I think the plant still has enough photosynthetic area to operate. The downy mildew, however, on the image on the right, that is something that I would be concerned about because you can begin to see the yellowing. Its photosynthetic capacity is going down, so it does need some help there. So monitor during those wet periods of time so that way you aren't going to be concerned about these diseases being developed. One thing that I always say when I talk about plant diseases, especially our fungal diseases, sanitation is important. If you have leaves or parts falling off of your plants and they're diseased, do not leave them on the ground. All that's going to do is it's going to put the disease right back in your soil, and you're just going to be doing this dance again in the future. Clean up the ground, maybe plant in a different location the following year so that way the disease goes away, and then plant again a few years later. And hopefully you will have avoided the disease entirely. So there are a few insects that will readily attack sunflowers. One that I'm going to highlight is the sunflower moth. This is one that we do have. These guys are going to be consuming the flower parts, the seeds, and some of the leaf tissue of sunflowers. Unfortunately, they are a little bit nasty. They spread a sticky webbing over the surface of the plant, kind of like Indian meal moth will if you get those in your cupboard or if you've ever had them, or a little bit like the tent caterpillars that we're going to be seeing here before too long. The good thing about sunflower moths is that since they're caterpillars, they're very sensitive to BT sprays, and BT stands for Bacillus thuringiensis. This is a spray that uses a protein that will only affect insects. So unless you have a digestive tract like an insect, it will have absolutely no effect on you. Now, using a BT spray does mean that the insect will need to consume leaf or plant tissue in order to take in the actual active ingredient. So it does have some downsides, but it is fairly effective against these, and it will probably minimize impact because BT does not exist in the environment for very long at all. It will barely last for a day sometimes. So that way the harm that you could potentially cause to pollinators will be minimized. Unfortunately, trying to mechanically remove these can be a challenge, and the webbing can really create a challenge for the plant, enhance its chances of getting diseased. So you're going to want to monitor for this one and keep an eye on your leaf tissue. If you notice leaves are getting eaten early on, watch the plant as the flower head begins to develop. Make sure you don't have sunflower moths. There are a few other insects that will attack sunflowers. Stink bugs, leaf-footed bugs, and aphids will all appear on sunflowers. However, their management is the same across most of the plants they're on, and we've kind of covered that in other programs. So what I'd invite you guys to do is just kind of take a look at some of our other programs we recorded, or just go ahead and ask those questions now or email them to me, and I will get those addressed with you. That won't be hard at all. And our final biggest issue that we have with sunflowers, deer. Deer are the #1 killer of sunflowers in Indiana, unfortunately. Deer will absolutely destroy a stand of sunflowers, whether they walk through it and stomp it or if they eat it. Your sunflowers are open season. You are going to need to consider fencing to prevent their presence. But one thing that we always tell, and if any of you are master gardeners, you probably heard me say this before, you're going to want to avoid repellent and sonic devices. These things generally don't work. Sometimes they're just snake oil. Sometimes they're just there to try to get you to spend a buck. They do not work. Some sonic devices are useless. You can defend them with some deer fencing. So keep that in mind depending on where you live. Thankfully, here in Terre Haute, we don't have that problem. But if I lived just a mile or two to the east, I would definitely be fighting with the deer on these. So keep your eyes open for the deer. All right, to summarize this, so sunflowers have a really long history. There are several interesting facts to them, and I invite you guys to take a look at organizations like the National Sunflower Association. They have a lot of information on this. Some of the information from this came from their information. Sunflowers are also really easy to grow and maintain. So if you have children or grandchildren that you want to have like a summer project with, this is an ideal one. For those of you who have kids in 4-H, this is a great 4-H project that I'm willing to bet your educator would be happy to help you with. And of course, sunflowers are great because they provide us food. We love sunflower seeds. And sunflowers just look pretty. We like the way they look in their yards, and we like the way they track the sun. And they're just kind of that great native plant that we can take advantage of and enjoy throughout the summer season. All right, that is what I have for you guys this evening. So I've got my contact information up here. Please feel free to give me a call or email me anytime. I've been doing that the last few days with a few of you on here. I also have a link to the Purdue Ed Store, which has publications on a variety of topics that can help you out, and the Purdue Plant and Pest Diagnostic Lab. These guys will help you figure out diseases, insects, any number of things. So feel free to look them up. And if you have an issue, they've got instructions on how to contact them and get samples to them right on their website.